This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Strange days, strange times. I'm glad that no senior Tories come on this programme because given the proper questioning that they are always exposed to on their annual tour of local radio studios, if I had access to Home Secretaries or Prime Ministers or Cabinet Ministers or any of that, I'd be profoundly embarrassed, possibly even humiliated today by the ease with which people at BBC Cambridge and BBC Manchester managed to actually speak a tiny bit of truth to power and hold these jokers to account. And speaking of jokers, it's a mad election, isn't it? It could still be, it's probably still a year away, although whispers are growing that the cynical nature of politicking at the moment suggests it may be sooner rather than later. If you could apply the laws of logic, the most basic laws of logic to Suella Braverman, but of course you can't, that is the definition of unhinged, you would think she thinks there's going to be a snap election, quite a snappish election, a snappier election than the general consensus allows, because she is so clearly already campaigning for the leadership battle that would follow a Conservative defeat. So, you could look at her disgusting outbursts this week. And we'll talk a little later about how she's made the Mail on Sunday, the first newspaper in history, compelled to apologise for an article written by a cabinet minister. Now, here's a little prediction for you. If you find yourself routinely reading or tuning into client journalists, you probably haven't heard about that story. The Mail on Sunday becoming the first newspaper in British history to apologise for an arguably racist lie told by the actual Home Secretary. More on that a little bit later in the programme. But I mentioned the sort of looming election for the very simple reason that you would struggle now to tell me on what platforms the Tories are going to fight. Now, you wouldn't, I don't think, be able to construct a PhD thesis on what platforms Labour are going to fight the next election. But in terms of promises or policies to make your life better, what do you think the Tories can do? Yeah. I have to interrupt those silences, otherwise the emergency tape kicks in and you start listening to an episode of my Full Disclosure podcast. But I'm never entirely sure just how much silence I can get away with. There have been times when you've heard Keith in my ear go, "Speak! Speak! Say something!" Because the silence is stretching out to such a degree that the emergency tape is about to kick in. But what would they fight it on? Now, that fella who is very emblematic, really, of just how desperate the Tory situation has become, 30p Lee Anderson, or Leenock, I'm told, to his mates, he has given the game away, actually, whether he was too thick to realise that you're not supposed to say that stuff out loud, or whether it is just an incapability of conceiving anything more complicated. He essentially said it's going to be culture wars and transgender arguments. That's all we've got. That's all we've got to fight the next election on. Partly because Jeremy Corbyn was the main reason why people who shifted their vote from Labour to Conservative in 2019, he's gone. Tory attempts to somehow nail Keir Starmer to Jeremy Corbyn's shrinking mast are not succeeding. They're not. Doesn't mean they won't succeed when we get nearer to the time, but they are not succeeding. And Brexit has been done, and so has the country, eh? Really? That's the ultimate irony of Brexit. It got done and so did you. And most people, or a growing number of people now, are ready to admit that. So they can't even campaign on that. I think they'd even struggle, and it wouldn't be a proper policy, pledging to improve your life. I think they'd even struggle to campaign on don't vote Labour because they'll reverse Brexit. Probably quite a lot of waverers would go, "Oh, that's good. Then they've got my vote." So they can't campaign. They can't campaign on any of the issues that they won in 2019 on. And if the numbers don't really support this, but outside the Westminster bubble, but inside the Westminster bubble, there is still a profound belief that Boris Johnson was possessed of some sort of electoral Viagra that reached parts other politicians could not reach. The electorate don't confirm that, but pretty much every right-wing commentator in the country remains convinced of it, but he's not there either. So you're not going to be able to have any Boris Johnson flavoured vavavoom entering into the conversation either. So what the hell are they going to do? The maddest thing about Tory politics for the last 10 years or so is the shovel loads of cash that they have So I think they're all Australian as well, which makes it even funnier. The shovel loads, barrow loads of cash that they have shipped to so-called advisors whose only job really is to come up with what they call wedge issues, something which will be divided on. What a coincidence that a survey appears today suggesting that we're now a little bit more concerned about immigration than we were last year. Still less concerned about immigration than we are about, say, the economy or the health service. But just you wait until the newspapers start turning up the heat again, and old Nige, creepy Uncle Nige, gets down to Dover with his Fisher-Price binoculars and starts taking his weird little selfies again with desperate refugees in the background. You know, as that dial gets turned up, so will public interest or public concern about immigration. There's a story we'll get on to later about 1 million British children either sleeping on the floor or sharing a bed with a sibling, often a considerably older sibling. 1 million British children who haven't got a bed of their own. But hey-ho, let's get cross about 20 mile per hour speed limits being introduced into areas where people are more likely to be crossing the road. I digress slightly, but I don't, because that 20 mile per hour speed limit is a wedge issue. Sunak today reported he's going to come out. Daily Mail, always the place to go to when you want to find out how the manipulations are proceeding. Sunak's fight back in war on motorists. So, sitting around a table somewhere in SW1, they've decided that this is a wedge issue. I think the Uxbridge and Ruislip by-election probably helped, because although the Tories hemorrhaged votes in Uxbridge and Ruislip, they clung on to the seat by their fingertips, and the main reason for that was largely misinformation and propaganda masquerading as journalism being undertaken by various right-wing commentators and pundits, people believing that ULEZ was going to hurt them financially when it wasn't. Not saying it won't hurt anybody, but it won't hurt anything like the number of people that voted against it because they thought it was going to hurt them. So the Tories think, well, we can tell lies about motoring. That seems to work with the mugs that we conned with Brexit. And that there is the question that every Conservative activist and campaigner and politician is asking them. What's going to work? What lies will work on the mugs who fell for Brexit? That's our only chance of getting back into power in 2024. We need to find a new load of lies to tell the people who we managed to con to vote against their own interests and to become the first country in the history of the world to impose economic sanctions on itself. And the contempt with which they and their friends in think tanks and newspapers must hold you, if you're in that category, should really prompt you to give your head a wobble. They despise you. They simultaneously despise you and find you hilarious. You did what? You persuaded people to actually vote to lose their own job. Yep, we did it. We got it. We got over the line. But hey ho, trebles all round for the lads and the people who fund our think tanks. They're delighted with it all. They think they're going to be able to wash away workers' protections and health and safety legislation. We can have poisons. We got poisons now that you can't buy in the European Union, but you can pour them all over the UK. It's getting fantastic. Looking good. So that's how it works. Those are the plans. That is the plan. The very simple search for wedges. And they can't really find any, apart from the war on motorists, or in Suella Braverman's case, the war on the multiculturalism that has allowed people of her background to rise to the very top of British politics. Down with that sort of thing, she says, leaving Rishi Sunak too frightened to say, shut up. Don't be so stupid and disgusting. It's obvious that we live in a country where diversity and multiculturalism have succeeded. It's a work in progress, but our very existence in these very jobs is evidence of how successful it has been. So that can't work either. 12 minutes after 10 is the time. And then Labour gives them the occasional bone which they can't wait to start gnawing. And that is the 20% on private school fees, the potential increase of 20% on private school fees, the VAT being applicable now to purchases that parents make that is not currently applicable. So there's VAT on everything else that you buy with a relatively small number of exemptions. But if you're buying education for your children at the moment, you don't pay we don't pay VAT on it. And it's a fascinating political gambit, this. I don't really today want to talk about your personal relationship with the issue. We talked about that a lot earlier in the week, and there are really, 4 or 5 categories of people, aren't there? So you've got the people who are going to be affected by it and are going to be able to pay it quite comfortably, people who are going to be affected by it and are not going to be able to pay it quite comfortably, but will probably be okay, or they'll just not be okay. I put you in the same category. People who think that it is actually natural justice at work, it's proper politics, it's redistribution of wealth, it's reducing advantage, it's increasing fairness and equality. And then you've got people who think, well, it's got nothing to do with me. It's got absolutely nothing to do with me. So that's where the question of whether or not the politics will work kicks in. So there are attempts to claim that Labour have done some sort of flip-flop or reverse. They haven't. They've just come to a slightly better understanding of charity loopholes, which abound in tax law and law in general. And there may still be another loophole that allows some schools to avoid imposing VAT on school fees. But the simple political proposal is that the 7% of children in this country who attend private school, by that you shave off bursaries and scholarships, but the large majority of them who have their fees paid by family members or sponsors or friends are going to have VAT applied to their school fees. Now, the wedge, the advice from the highly paid activists or advisors is that we should turn this into a class war. You can tell I'm in one of those moods. I promise I'll take calls at some point, but I'm not in a position to say exactly when, because I've got an anecdote to share with you that I don't think I've shared before. They want to turn it into a class war. My question for you is it going to work? So really, I want to hear from people, parents or non-parents, who will never send their children to private school. Okay, so it might be because your children are 48, or it might be because you are, unless short of getting a lucky scratch card or winning the lottery, you're simply never going to be in the financial universe where you've got 15 grand minimum or 50 grand maximum left after tax to spend on your children's education, or you would be politically opposed to it, although in that case I can probably predict what your position would be on this story. I want to talk about the politics of it, and indeed the politics of class war. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need to tell me what you think of this policy. And I really want to hear from you if you don't like it, despite the fact that it's never going to affect you. I want to hear from you if you do like it, despite the fact that it's never going to affect you. But the where are we? The notion that it is actually going to swing your needle, it's going to nudge your political needle, despite the fact that it doesn't affect you, is probably the most interesting psephological element of the looming election, because most of us are not going to be affected, positively or negatively, by the wedge issues that the Tories are going to be determined to debate on. You know, you can probably make a case that reducing a speed limit in a highly built-up residential area from 30 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour is going to have a huge impact on my life. It's only going to have positive impacts, apart from making you a bit late for work or a bit late for school or something like that. The calculation is that Labour is going to make various promises to change your life, and the Tories are going to make various attempts to turn you against policies that are not going to change your life. And the truth lies somewhere between the two of them. Okay, so what do you think of this policy? 0345 6060 973. What do you think of a policy that essentially seeks to recognise that you shouldn't get any form of tax exemption on payments made to award your children advantages denied to 93% of the nation's children? What do you think of the politics here? 0345 6060 973. And then after the junction and before the calls start, I will share with you my personal, very odd and slightly traumatic experience of class war. I was a teenage victim of class war in circumstances that still make me slightly uncomfortable, because I thought I was on the other side of the class war. And an experience in the Museum Gardens in York in about 1989 made me realise that actually, for anyone watching from the outside, I was on the other side of the class war. 18 minutes after 10 is the time. So that's the question. You, as a voter, are not going to cast your vote according to Labour's school fees policy unless you are currently paying school fees and really, really, really resent, fear, or object to the idea of having to pay more. But for people who will not be directly affected by it, either through choice or circumstance, what do you think of the politics? The politics. 0345 6060 973. It's 10:18.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 10. I will, by popular demand, postpone my class war experience and share it with you a little later and get some phone calls on the board first. I can't. I don't know. I don't know that I've ever really nailed the art of a phone-in designed to map political opinion solely rather than experience. So is putting VAT on school fees going to change your vote? You can tell me that. Is it going to make any difference to the bigger numbers, to the metrics, to the bigger picture? I don't know that we can ever really do that in a phone-in, because unlike opinion pollsters, we can't select, We can't have a cultivated or a curated sample. I can only speak to the people that call me. And even if everyone says X, then it might be that there's more people listening who think Y. 22 after 10 is the time. The phone lines are open. And if you're not going to be personally affected by a VAT imposition on school fees, I want to hear what you think of it politically, ethically, philosophically, personally. Henry's in Mitcham to kick things off. Henry, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Henry.
We're very fortunate that we do probably have enough money to send our kids private, but we looked around a state school last night and have decided to send them to state. Quite a few of our friends are sending their kids to private school. I mean, the state school is extremely good, so that perhaps affects things slightly. So
definitely.
If you live in an area where you don't have a good state school, then that might influence. But we do have a good state school, and they're still sending them to private. Obviously, the VAT, there probably are some of our friends that are on the cusp of being able to afford it with that increase. I'm of the personal opinion that I don't think private schools should exist, because I don't think that essentially if you ban private schools and public schools, then there would be an impetus to improve state schools, and until that happens, there is no drive for the people in power or the people with the money to improve state schools, because obviously you send your children, obviously there are people with different needs, and I accept that, but ultimately you do send your children to private school to gain an advantage over state schools. Now, I'm speaking as my wife went to private school, lots of my friends went to private school.
Yes.
I didn't, so I see it from both sides.
Well, I think you probably see it a little bit more clearly, because I, with all my lefty credentials, as someone who is both a parent of and a benefit of private education, I balk at that bit that you said, the idea that you can't govern honestly on education issues if your children are not going through the education system that the massive majority of the electorate go through. But I think you're right. It's an emotional response. I kind of respond to you saying that by going, oh, don't be silly. That's like saying you can't care about the poor unless you're rich. But if your children aren't in that system, and you are in charge of that system, you're surely going to engage with things differently from how you would engage if they were in it.
Absolutely. If they like, let's say Jacob Rees-Mogg's children went to state school, there is no doubt there would be an impetus to improve state schools and up the funding. They would not be short of pencils and paper and other materials.
Feeding children in the mornings, or
absolutely. So until that happens, I admit it's quite black and white.
Yeah.
But essentially that is the case. I mean, I looked around private schools and the state school, and obviously the big difference is class sizes, and it blew my mind really that even in the lower years that there are, say, 8 to 10 children per class. I mean, obviously they're going to have a far better experience. Having said that, they'll have a better learning experience. They'll concentrate more. I mean, my state school was particularly awful.
Was it?
It wasn't horrendous, but the behaviour was not there. The attention was not there. But it's not just that. I tried to explain to my wife, who is a doctor, lots of our friends are doctors, that when I went for careers advice, they essentially they asked me which local factory I wanted to work in,
Really?
which at the time I wasn't in the slightest driven. But when I met my wife, I was meeting doctors, solicitors, all these kind of professionals, and it was never really even talked about in our school that you could even do that. So the actual, it's so different. I mean, so I don't, in terms of the VAT, going back to the VAT thing, is it a bad thing? Yes, but I kind of, does it really matter? I don't know. Will it dramatically affect? Obviously, it affects some people in the middle that are scraping together, but intrinsically, it won't change the overall position. The rich people will still, send their rich people. I mean, I heard something this morning about someone I think it was television that are saying, if you pay all your fees up front, then you can escape the VAT thing. Well, obviously, people scraping together, again, that only helps the very rich.
Yes.
The people scraping together are not going to be able to pay it in one lump sum.
But that's where the politics might work. If you need to ignore the numbers because they will be close to negligible. But the people who really will be squeezed out by it, while, as you remind us, people who've got capital, people who've got a lot of wealth, as ever, actually get a cheaper deal on everything than people who are less well off because they can just stick the whole lot in up front. Do you think, and in the circles you move, you're very, very well placed to answer this question, do you think it's going to have political salience for people not directly squeezed out of the game? People who either have to, save a little bit more to keep their children in these schools, or people like you, really, who aren't going to send your children to these schools at all, but could do if you were so minded.
I think politically we're in a strange situation in that most of my friends would definitely not vote Conservative.
Right.
But it may possibly sway them to vote Lib Dem or something like that, although they're obviously making noise about possibly going even further in certain ways. So it may make them think again, but they certainly wouldn't vote Conservative.
Whatever the weather, and however loud and violent the attempts to turn this into a class war issue. Henry, that's a perfect opening call because you're both inside the story and outside observing it, which I suppose in a sense I am, but from the other side of the fee-paying fence. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need to nail the politics of it, which Henry just introduced at the end perfectly. I mean, we're living in an era where however loud the newspapers shout, with the exception still of immigration, they don't change the game anywhere near as much as they thought anywhere near as much as they used to, and as much as some of them still believe that they do. So when you read about that Tories, Rishi Sunak later today, I probably should have mentioned this sooner, is going to accuse Labour of waging a class war. So think of the people involved. Rishi Sunak, one of the richest men in the world, is accusing Keir Starmer, who his working class credentials, if you care about such things, are impeccable. His mother worked in the NHS, his wife worked in the NHS. His career was spent in public service as a lawyer, and he grew up understanding what a shortage of cash looked like. He is going to accuse Keir Starmer of a class war, of waging class war. One of the richest men in the world accusing Keir Starmer of waging, son of a toolmaker, of waging class war. Is it going to work? I'd like to say, are you going to fall for it? But I guess that brings my prejudices too far to the fore. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. It's 10:30.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:34 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Here's a little slice of Sunak. As I mentioned to you, it falls to the BBC's regional reporters and, of course, Global's regional reporters as well, to go to places where, oddly, studio-based London broadcasters rarely seem to manage to reach when they're interviewing senior members of government. I ask them some difficult or some important questions. And this is the political editor of BBC South, Peter Henley, talking to Rishi Sunak yesterday about this school fees issue that we're discussing now.
So what do you think of Labour trying to make it more expensive?
Labour's approach to that just illustrates that they don't understand the aspirations of families like my parents, who are working really hard. They wanted to do something for their kids that they thought would make a difference to them. And I think Labour's approach to that is to clamp down on it, right? They don't understand the aspiration that people have to try and provide a better life for their kids, and they want to punish them for that as some part of some class war. I don't think that's right. You know, my family emigrated to this country. They didn't have an enormous amount, but they worked really hard. They integrated, and they just wanted to give their kids everything they could. I think that's quite a natural instinct that many families will feel, and I want to make sure that my government, my party, is on the side of people like that, because that's how I was raised and those are my values.
Is it going to work? Is it going to wash as a class war? John's in Edinburgh. John, what do you think?
Well, I don't. Yeah, so it's a bit of a strange interest I have, because I don't think our kids will be going to private school. So
Right.
We've got 3 kids, but if you go back to the start, the way I come at it is education. Private education is as old as the hills. There's
Yes.
always been teachers and of all sorts over the ages. State education, compulsory state education, is a relatively new thing.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden-
Historically speaking, I mean, not in sort of living memory terms.
Yeah. But what I don't understand is why people think. So even though I can't, I'm not going to be part of that system. What right does the state have to take away or interfere in the private education? And I think paying.
Well, that's a question about what right the state has to impose taxes, mate.
Yeah, I don't see. Yeah,
You're paying VAT on your breakfast.
Yeah, I think though taking away some of the burden for educating children from the state and doing it privately.
But they're providing education for every child in the country, whether parents choose to take it up or not. I could be wrong, but I don't think this has got the libertarian flavour to it that you're pursuing.
So my problem
here is free full-time education for your child from year 1 to year 13. Here it is, right? Oh, okay, I don't want that. I'm going to spend a ton of money on getting them a better deal, a better advantage than the 93% of children in the state system. It's okay, that's fine, you carry on. But obviously, if I'm putting VAT on your breakfast, I'm going to have to put VAT on that as well. That's how I see it. Doesn't mean it's the right way or the only way to see it, but it seems pretty clear to me that that's what's going on.
You don't pay VAT on children's shoes, do you? So, there's different things that you can do.
Nobody pays VAT on children's shoes, but you don't get free shoes from the public purse for every child in the country from year 1 to year 13. So I don't know that shoes play a role in any comparisons here.
Well, okay, back to the education thing.
Yeah.
I don't think pulling some people down helps pull others up. I don't buy that, and I think that the government, it's like people how much do you really care about the poor or how much do you hate the rich? And I think it's a jealousy. I think that's what they're playing into this political policy from Labour. It's more about. Well, then I'm
the perfect counter to that, because I'm paying it and I'll be hit with the extra 20%. So I can't be jealous of myself, can I? But I think it's a move towards a fairer society.
I don't think you're a typical voter. I know a lot of people.
Well, I can only tell you where I'm coming from. The fewer people that have an education like mine, the better. I beg your pardon. The fewer people that have the paid-for privilege of an education like mine, the more likely you are to see an education like mine spread further around the country, and that would be for the general good.
It'd be good, yeah, and it's great. And like I said, I know people went to private school. I don't see how charging extra tax on that is going to help the state sector. I don't see it.
It's £1.5 billion, about 6,000 teachers, they reckon.
I think it's the politics of kind of grievance.
Okay, and you can keep saying that, and I can keep giving you evidence why it isn't. Not just personal.
It's not evidence, though. It's your opinion.
Well, no, it's not.
It's your opinion versus my opinion.
No, it's not. It's not. You're saying that my position is based on envy, and I'm pointing out it can't be, because I'm in the category of people that are going to be affected by it.
I didn't say your position was based on envy.
Everybody else who thinks like I think is based on envy.
No, I'm talking about my life and people that I know who are against private education, and it's basically because they dislike the wealthier, people with more money. Yeah. And I'm not in that category. I'm not in that category.
I have to take your word for that. But obviously, if you put VAT on private education, they're still going to be wealthy. But I guess you have to explain that to your friends.
It'll be more elitist. It'll become more elitist.
That's the problem. That's the problem. Abolish it altogether, or nibble at the edges. In philosophical and ethical terms, it's better for the community to nibble at the edges. But I suspect that in terms of genuine equality and genuine fairness, it would be better to get rid of the whole thing. No Labour government's going to do that. Although in my lifetime, I sense I'm older than you, in my lifetime it was actually Labour policy. I had the remarkable experience of sitting in A-level politics class at one of the most prestigious public schools in the country next to a lad whose auntie was a Labour Education Secretary of State pledging to abolish private schools. It was a much more complicated family situation than that little vignette allows. But, it was policy. It was, for a very, very long time, something that Labour pushed hard for. But that ship sailed. I think it sailed with Tony Blair, who, of course, was educated at a public school just down the road from where you are in Edinburgh. 10:40 is the time. Alan is in Bristol. Alan, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Hi, James. About 11, 12 years ago, I was working in a very prestigious private boarding school in Surrey, where the fees were more than my take-home pay, for one student.
What was that like? What was that? I mean, I think John has a point. I was probably a bit dismissive of it about some of this being motivated by resentment or envy. What was it like to know that you were getting paid less for a year than those children's parents were paying to send them to the place where you were?
Well, but the kids themselves were fantastic, and it was a very, very easy place to work, in small classes and well-behaved students, and it was an absolute joy to work there. Any contact with parents, I hated that. Parents' evenings and parents getting in touch. Why is my child only achieving a C? We're paying you lots of money, and you were. So the parents, I didn't like the parents, and 95% plus of them, I would say, were in finance of some kind. They were, society's takers. But anyway, I'll just tell you my little story.
Yeah, please.
We had, I'm not sure when this was, if it was the last Labour government or the new Tory government, because it would have been around about 2010. I was there 2009 to 2012. And there was something being imposed, taking away charitable status from private schools. Is that right?
Yeah, but I think that's wobbled as a consequence of charity loopholes and the fact that I don't know the full details, but the headline is the VAT, the charitable status has been abandoned.
Yeah. I remember that. So the chairman of governors got up, and all the other board of governors were there. They're all in grey suits. They're all bald, and for some reason they all had very shiny heads.
But you see, you are now sounding like a class warrior. You can't object to the fact that they all wore suits, Alan, or had shiny heads.
Well, no, all right, no, it was just interesting. It was comical.
All right, so there's a homogeneity about them.
Yeah. And the chairman of governors stood there and saying, where there's been problems, about fees and VAT. He said, luckily, on the board of governors, most of us are chartered accountants, and we've sat around for hours and hours, and we've managed to find a loophole.
Yes.
So this is, it's just sort of echoing what you're saying, and I've no idea what the loophole was.
One of them is to pay your fees years in advance to escape a VAT charge in the first year of a Labour government. So that's this week's loophole, is that you could avoid it by paying it up front, which is obviously not going to apply to everybody, but it will apply to some.
Yeah, but it was just this horrible cynicism. They're trying to do this to us, but we've beaten them. We're all chartered accountants. We know what we're talking about.
Yes. I think that's how wealth often approaches taxes, and it's one of the best things that they've communicated to people who benefit from tax. People who are net gainers from paying tax have been persuaded that taxes are their enemy, even though they get more out of the pot than they put into it, which is true, I think, of most of the population. It's certainly a hell of a lot more than most people would think if they were asked. And so in a sentence, Alan, the politics of it appeal to you because...
Well, I'm going to sound like a class war again, really.
I said in a sentence. I didn't realise we were going to have so many pauses.
Sorry. All right. Okay. All right. To raise money to go into state schools to bring state, to have Rishi Sunak saying, if you pay money, you get a better education. Well, that shouldn't be right.
Shouldn't be the case, no. And you're never going to move towards a world where it's not true until the access to the quotes better education is either non-existent or negligible. Amanda in Berkshire adopts the role of the parent I find most confusing, and I say that respectfully, Amanda, in that you're paying this money and you don't think it's because it gives your children an advantage. She writes, "This makes my blood boil. I thought we lived in a free country. There are multiple reasons to send your child to a private school, not just to give them an advantage, and definitely not just because you are rich, which I am not. And by contrast, why should I," writes this texter, "be subsidising private education? If a parent can afford $15,000 a term, why can't they afford $18,000? It's not the public's position to pay for something elitist. That's already provided for by the stat. And then tax exempt it on top is clearly ridiculous." Here's a little question to ponder. By the time I come back from this junction, I may have realised it's not quite as clever a question as I thought it was. But how come introducing ULEZ is condemned as a fundraising tactic that is not actually designed to clean air, but is designed to just put cash into the public coffers, as if that's suddenly somehow a bad thing to be doing? So ULEZ is bad because it's a fundraising tactic, and yet putting money on school fees is also bad because it's a fundraising tactic. It's 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:49 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I think that the Independent Schools Council covers all private schools. So here's the thing. That I'm being a bit self-indulgent on this, but in terms of why I managed to still find stuff really, really interesting, even if we've talked about it a lot together in the past, partly come up with new ways. That's my job. Come up with new introductions, new ways of thinking about things, new ways of asking the question, but also things that still have the power to shock you. So we are talking about Labour's plans to put VAT on school fees. You currently pay VAT on your trousers, but you don't pay it if you're paying thousands of pounds to buy, as I do, an education for your children that you think is better than what would be available if you weren't paying money. That's what we're talking about, right? The Independent Schools Councils reckoned that there are, beginning of last year, there were 544,316 pupils at these schools. The fees, by the way, have gone up exponentially since I was at public school. The numbers now are staggering. 5% this year, 2% the year before, 6% in 2019. And it hasn't had an appreciable effect on the overall numbers. But so we're talking about, as a nation, as a country, this is what Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have put into the political mixer, 544,316 pupils, a tiny proportion of whom may be excluded from the education they currently enjoy by the introduction of VAT. Although personally I doubt it. I think it's what economists call an inelastic market, but we'll see. There's some research published elsewhere today which is getting approximately 1% of the attention that the story about these 544,316 children in Britain is getting, that tells us that 1 million children in Britain don't have a bed of their own. They are either sleeping on the floor or sharing a bed with a sibling or another family member. More than 1 million children in the UK either sleep on the floor or share a bed with parents or siblings because their family cannot afford the luxury of replacing broken frames and mouldy linen. And that's come from the children's charity Bernardo's. and that's mad, yeah? And I'm guilty. I'm planning on talking about that later, but 544,316 pupils, a tiny proportion of whom may lose their access to private education in the event of Labour introducing VAT on school fees. Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, leader of a party that's been in power for 13 years in a country where over 1 million children haven't got a bed of their own. Where's the class war, mate? Where's the class war, Prime Minister? Where's the enemy of aspiration? 10:52 is the time. Rosie is in Melverley, in North Shropshire. Rosie, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
Lovely to speak to you. Thank you very much for having me on.
You're very welcome.
So I was incredibly lucky to be privately educated, as were my brother and sister, at quite a prestigious boarding school in Derbyshire. My family have all been privately educated, and it's the class war happened for real for me in my own house when I married a state school teacher.
Oh, yes.
And we had to, we're now expecting our first child, and we've obviously had to have quite a lot of conversations about how we're going to be managing that in the future. And I have had a bit of a personal epiphany in that I think that private school fundamentally is something that it absolutely should be taxed. The fact that it has charitable status is beyond me when I think back to my school life and trying to understand why my school would need to be a charity. It really is. I can't think of anything that we did positively to impact the wider community than ourselves, really, and aren't charities supposed to do good?
That's pretty damning. I mean, there'd be plenty. I can push back a bit against that. There would have been probably bursaries that you didn't know about, or some scholarships that you didn't know about, and you probably did do some work in the community, even if you didn't register at the time that it had an altruistic bent to it. But the charitable status is actually proving more complicated than the VAT. But the VAT exemption is historically built on charitable status, so they're taking that away. The epiphany is based on what? Based upon your grasp of basic fairness?
I think so. I mean, so for me, two things that I've really kind of observed watching my husband with his kind of career and how he's been teaching and the way that the school system has worked. One thing that I have noticed is that he's taught in two kind of very different schools, one very rural and one quite in a nice town near where we live. And the difference, in funding levels, but B, in kind of parental engagement that the students had and support that was available for the students at the different schools kind of made one school a much more pleasant and high-achieving environment than the other. And I just wonder whether increasing, by adding VAT onto private school fees, would you push some parents that perhaps maybe have a little bit more, have a little bit more time to be extra invested in there, or the resources.
Well, and inclination, because I mean, albeit that we both probably went to school with some people whose parents still subscribe to the Victorian notion that children should be seen and not heard, and they just sort of outsourced all the childcare but for the more aspirational middle class, it is parents who prioritise education above other things that they could have spent the money on, and I think, like you, I think bringing those parents into the state sector is a win-win.
Definitely. I think even just from seeing the difference in the kind of the PTAs at the two schools between the school in the state school in the nicer area where where the mums maybe weren't working, or they had additional resources to provide, to organise things like extra bake sales and all
just
the
buy a
amazing
minibus
things that
so they can go on school trips, fundraising, all that kind of thing. Do you think? I mean, so you're in an interesting and quite specific cohort. Do you think, as an overview, Rosie, do you think it's politically salient, this? Do you think this is going to nudge many people's needles?
I don't see how it couldn't, really, because I think, you said earlier that 7% of children are privately educated. So the rest of the 93 of us are all going, well, yeah, fair enough.
Well, there's another category that we missed, actually, that Tracy's been in touch to remind us of. She says that what about people that do use independent schools and will be scuppered by the plan but still support it, which is where I sit, writes Tracy. I don't think Sunak can turn this into Labour not understanding hard-working people and aspiration. Surely hard-working people that can't pay for it will just feel insulted, which plays into what Rosie was saying. It'd be interesting. I mean, they are desperate for wedge issues, and that's why today you're hearing about a war on aspirational middle classes and a war on motorists. Rishi Sunak casting himself as the hero you didn't know you needed to protect you from these class warriors and these people waging wars on cars. I just find it a bit daft, frankly, but that doesn't mean it won't work. This, after all, is the land of Brexit. Thank you, Rosie. Christopher is in Wandsworth. Christopher, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
Thank you. I was last night in a school in my area, very deprived school, but a very good school in the sense they're doing great work. And I was there speaking to some of the pupils about what I do. I do work in the media, and the headmaster at the end said to me, the thing is, for the vast majority of the pupils, they don't have any access to anyone who's in a quote unquote middle class profession, say the media, say the top jobs. And I think that I think hits at the heart of this discussion. If you go to the independent school, I went to an independent school, is that access to those elite roles, those elite jobs that seem to be cut off for people at the other end. And I just think
you can't be what you can't see, which is often applied in race conversations. But obviously, as with almost all issues that apply to race, it actually applies to socioeconomic status at least as much.
Yes, I just think it's gone too far, the inequality. You're always going to have some inequality, but it's just gone too far, as you made the point about 1 million children not able to have a bed to sleep in. There's got to be some kind of investment in the state system.
After 13 years of austerity, which was neither necessary nor particularly well explained.
Well, if you're at Eton College, you're going to have £50,000 spent on your education. If you're at the same comprehensive nearby, it's going to be 7,000.
Is that right? I'd have to trust you on that.
Well, I mean, I think it's around 7,000 that's incoming from the government. But I think that the other thing, obviously, is what happens at the top universities. There has to be a kind of move, I think that is happening, that you kind of handicap it so that if you have done very well at a school that is at the poorer end, that you kind of, that is...
No, I think you put it very well, and from a very personal perspective. And oddly, I don't know why, but while you were talking, my brain went off in a slightly different direction with regard to Rishi Sunak, who I think is worth about £750 million in conjunction with his wife. Because if you want to say, well, I'm very worried that Labour is attacking the aspirational parents, aspirational, hard-working parents, you say you're absolutely right. Let's leave VAT then on private schools, and let's bring in a massive asset tax on people with personal wealth of more than, say, £100 million. Because that's not going to curtail your existence. Let's just tax you 50% on all your assets straight away, get the country back on its feet, and then we can go back to pursuing epic and unnecessary wealth on an industrial scale. So you presumably be comfortable with that, Rishi, would you? No? That's odd. You'd be telling us next that you want to get rid of inheritance tax, despite the fact it only benefits people like you.
James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 11 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Gary, my mate Gary, listens to the show while he's decorating. So he's an artisan. I don't know if you follow him on Twitter, the official GRB. Some of the work that he does in the field of decorating is mesmeric. Taking off about 200 years worth of paint from some cornicing was like watching, those weird things you hear about on YouTube, people watching other people open presents or something like that, unboxings. It's just mad, isn't it? The stuff that's been discovered through technology to be strangely compelling. He does some amazing stuff and gives you advice and stuff like that. But I know him very well. He's a pal of mine. Started off as a listener to the programme, but he's become a mate. And he listens to the programme more carefully than I do, which is odd given that I'm speaking, whereas he's just up a ladder with his headphones in. And he says, you forgot the hook and tease. I'm like, I didn't forget the hook. What hook and tease did I forget? I haven't forgot. And I did forget a hook and tease. I didn't tell you my class war story. And now we've moved on to another conversation. So I will have to endeavour to find a moment in the programme to tell you that story later, because I don't want to distract from the subject that we're talking about next. And I don't know for whose benefit I do the bit I'm about to do, whether I do it for your benefit or mine. When I talk to you about how this works, this bizarre relationship that we have together, the mornings that we spend together, and why some conversations go in different directions from others. So I feel guilty about the fact that I am much more drawn professionally to the story about the 500,000 children in private schools than I am to the over 1 million children not in their own beds. Now, the reason why that happens is because it's potentially, I don't know whether it's a better phone-in, but it is an easier phone-in, because there is automatically tension and polarity in place. You can And some days we choose not to do it in that way, but other days we revel in it. We relish the fisticuffs, the toing and froing. Here is somebody insisting that it's perfectly reasonable for them to get government help on buying educational advantages for their children, and here is someone to describe it as outrageous. Whereas when I tell you about 1 million children in the UK either sleeping on the floor or sharing a bed with parents or siblings because they can't afford the, quotes, luxury, end quotes, of replacing broken frames and mouldy linen, you probably feel, as I do, a temptation to turn away, a temptation to look away. You don't. I mean, it's certainly going to be very difficult to turn it into a two-sided brouhaha, isn't it? You know, well, here is, I mean, I know that television stations exist, and albeit that they're having some local difficulties at the moment, where they genuinely would try to argue, and they'd bring on some old dinosaur to claim, or some desperate attention-seeking youthful loser to claim that it's all the parents' fault. Actually, they'd get Lee Anderson to do it. They'd get the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party to come on and say, well, the only reason kids are sleeping on floors is because their parents have turned the beds into go-karts or something. I don't know what passes for... And he's not alone. You've got that Brendan Clark-Smith fella as well. You've got Jonathan Gullis. And then you've got the other ones. Do you remember the one who said, do you know, I know some people are struggling with the cost of living at the moment. Do you know that supermarkets have value ranges? Did you know this? You can go into a supermarket and they have got beans that are cheaper than Heinz. Heinz? They're cheaper than Heinz. So you must buy, if you're poor and you are struggling to pay your bills, we, the Conservative Party, who've created this economic situation and presided over the proliferation of food banks, we have your interests at heart. Therefore, as your local MP, I am here to tell you there are value ranges. Value ranges. Is that what they're called, Tristram? Have I got that right? Yes, boss. Value ranges in your local supermarket. It's incredible, isn't it? So I'm sure you could find the Tory to come along and tell you that the only reason why children are sharing beds with their siblings or sleeping on the floor, sleeping on mattresses on the floor, is because of lifestyle choices made by their feckless work-shy parents who spend all their money on flat-screen televisions. And what's the 2023 flat-screen TV? Is it vaping? What's the 2023? So when once someone behind this microphone who performatively hated poor people would claim that the only reason why people were struggling was because all the money was being spent on flat screen TVs. What is it in 2023? Have we got anything? Send your ideas in on a postcard, please, to 84850 or tweet at Mr. James O'B. What's the 2023 equivalent of flat screen TVs? I mean, it was nonsense when they pulled it out. It's just a desperate attempt to pretend that there's no such thing as poverty in this country, and the people you really need to worry about are not the people using food banks, but the people who are going to have to pay VAT on their children's school fees. That right there, for me, is the essence of political discourse in Brexit Britain. You have got about 80% of the media and all of the governing party more concerned, ostensibly more concerned, about VAT being introduced on school fees, which is going to have a meaningful effect upon an almost negligible number of people, than they are about food banks, warm banks, hungry families, and, in this case, bedless children. Who do you feel more sympathy for? The parent moaning about having to find a few more quid to pay school fees, or the parent who can't actually tuck their child into bed at night because there's no bed? And hey-ho, here's a job for you. Netflix, isn't it? Netflix. It's all about Netflix, not flat-screen TVs. So they're probably spending all their money on Netflix. That's why they can't afford a bed for their children. Or, of course, you remind me, avocados. Thank you, Aidan. Avocados and Netflix. They're spending all that. So that's the new flat-screen TV. Is that deflation or inflation? You think of a flat-screen TV, it was when it first started being used by liars and poverty deniers, it was still quite an enviable thing. I didn't have a flat-screen TV when poverty deniers and liars in the media started telling me that everybody on benefits did. I didn't actually have one. Netflix is a bit more achievable, isn't it? So that's quite sad, actually, that the kind of criteria for performatively hating poor people has probably come down a bit. Netflix and avocados. I've stopped saying, I hope you've noticed, I've stopped saying avocado pears. Do you know why I've stopped saying avocado pears? Because I was the only person left in the United Kingdom that called them avocado pears. I had to even check that they were once called avocado pears, because every time I called them an avocado pear, everybody laughed at me. You laughed at me. My inbox exploded with people laughing at me, and my own colleagues who were supposed to be there to boost me and make me feel confident and bouncy before coming on air in the morning, my own colleagues laughed at me when I said avocado pears. They were called avocado pears in the 1970s. They were a staple of Weight Watchers, I believe. Avocado pears and melons. My mum must have been on a diet once that involved avocado pears and melons, because I've got some sort of weird childhood memory of it. I used to make necklaces out of the melon seeds. Did you do that? So you get a needle, right? And you thread it with cotton. You dry the melon seeds, for God's sake. Otherwise, you're going to have all sorts of flies buzzing around your neck. You dry them out, clean them, dry them out, and then you thread a needle through each individual melon seed. And you can make a beautiful necklace, or even a bracelet if you're feeling a bit lazy. There you go. So I'm doing that thing where I'm trying to cheer you up, make you smile, keep you on board, because we're about to talk about something horrible. That's what I'm doing. That's why I lean more heavily into the conversation about private school fees, because I'm not getting my violin out for you, than I do into the conversation about children with no beds, because it makes me want to cry. And there it is. So what is a better story? For the purposes of the time that we spend together every day, private schools are a better story than bedless children. Why? Because it makes you want to cry as well. 12 minutes after 11 is the time. Bernardo's, the children's charity, says that increasing bed poverty reflects growing levels of destitution. Can you get the Daily Mail online too? I'm going to offer them an article about why there's no such thing as bed poverty. It doesn't exist at all. And for the next day's paper, I'll do a piece about, won't someone think of the private school parents having to pay VAT? No such thing as bed poverty. If you can't afford a bed for your children altogether now, you shouldn't have had them in the first place. There it is. A complete denial of the vicissitudes of modern life, or the fact that people who consider themselves to be haves can become have-nots in the blink of an eye or the flick of a finger. So that's why we don't do it. But we're doing it today. The charity says that increasing bed poverty reflects growing levels of destitution in which low-income families already struggling with food and gas bills often find they are unable to afford a comfortable night's sleep either. And I'll tell you for nothing, that makes everything worse. Any teacher will tell you that a tired child is a troubled child. A hungry child is a troubled child, and a tired child is a troubled child, and a hungry, tired child is not going to do as well at school that day as they would do if they were neither tired nor hungry. It's breathtaking. So about 700,000 children now sharing beds, while 444,000 are estimated to sleep on the floor, leaving them tired, anxious, and finding it hard to concentrate at school. I can't imagine you would want to jump in and phone me with the experience of what it's like, but I would be very grateful if you could share it. We will, of course, ring you straight back. We always do. But just give me the why of it, if you could. Give me the detail, because the headline is striking. The headline is stark. The detail is probably quite ordinary. So you know that the food bank, if you go to a food bank either as a donor or a volunteer or a user, and quite a lot of users are volunteers, you know. I think that is, I don't know, yesterday we had a conversation about what it means to be proud of the country that you grew up in, but that something makes me feel quite what the word is, admiration. Users become volunteers in food banks, but you will always be told that it's not just food, and that basic essentials like shampoo and soap, these are crucial constituents, non-perishable, ambient goods, I think they're called. You can wash the kids' clothes, wash the kids, wash yourself, wash your hair. All of that is of a great need in food banks. So if people can't afford little things, we always talk about the boiler, don't we? What happens if the boiler breaks? So you're running out of money at the end of the month. Remember that 40% of people on universal credit are in work, so we can't do the lazy Daily Mail, they're all unemployed, feckless work shy layabouts. It's a hell of a lot of people not in work. Almost everybody not in work doesn't deserve to be characterised like that either. But it's not just the boiler, is it? It's not just the boiler or the car. What if the wheel falls off the car? What if the boiler fails? You need a new boiler. That's an sort of outlay you can't even begin to imagine. But what if it is Yeah, what if it's just a bed? You ever broken a bed? Stop it, matron. I don't want those sort of stories. This is a family programme. You've ever broken a bed? I broke a bed once when I was a student. I had it propped up on books, I think. But that was suboptimal because, well, I don't spare you the details, but it used to fall apart quite regularly. And it wasn't a problem. I was a student. I was cool sleeping on the floor. Thought it was funky. Thought I was Withnell. My children haven't got a bed? That's a different story altogether. And remember, it's 440,000 sleeping on the floor. It's 700,000 estimated to be sharing a bed. So you haven't even got, I don't want to use the word privacy. What's the word I want? You haven't even got solitude when you go to bed at night. I read a poem when I was a kid. I don't know if this ever happens to you. Sometimes a line gets into your head in a way that you know it's never going to be removed. And it wasn't Kipling or Pam Ayres or one of the greats. I don't even know who wrote it. But the snuggly bits where the pillow fits. There's a poem about sleep. It was a poem about bedtime. And that still resonates with me because you're in your own space. You're in your own head. You're reflecting on the day. I used to do an audit as I got older. A little audit in my head of things that have gone well or things that have gone badly. And then when I got older still, it would be things I've got to do, essays I've got to write. And when, of course, I went away to boarding school, I took that line with me, the snuggly bits where the pillow fits. And even at boarding school, where you've got 40-odd snoring, grunting fellow pupils lying in some cases, 2 feet away from you. They're not lying in your actual bed. You've still got the snuggly bits where the pillow fits. But not if you've got your brother's feet next to you. You haven't. You haven't even got the snuggly bits where the pillow fits. What's that like? 0345 6060 973. And I believe it can happen very easily to people. I believe that a turn of the dice, a spin of the wheel, the fickle finger of fate, illness, unemployment, I believe it can happen to anybody. So I don't want any shame or embarrassment attached to this conversation. I want you to tell me why your children are sharing a bed with you or their siblings, why they're sleeping on the floor, and how it makes you feel. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And if you want, we can have a little look at the question of why we are all, you included, more comfortable talking about the school fees story than we are talking about this. 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 22 minutes after 11, and I don't actually understand why it's confusing or, quotes, controversial, end quotes. I really don't. You can run out of money. How hard can it be to conceive of running out of money? You've got there's no one you can ring. You've already borrowed off. You've got no money left. 3 days until any money comes in. You've got no money. And when the money comes in, it's all gone already on bills and food and essentials and necessaries. So if you need something big and unexpected and non-regular, like a bed, it's just not doable. Why is that so hard for people to understand? Especially when there are over 1 million children in the country who are without their own bed. I don't get it. Is it denial? Is it self-preservation? I don't want to think about it because then I'd recognise my own vulnerability. So I'd rather pretend that doesn't exist. If I pretend that condition doesn't exist, then my deep-rooted existential fears that I might one day end up in that condition will somehow be assuaged. I don't know. Gary's in Maidenhead. Gary, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, morning to you, James. We spoke before. I'm the old chap that sleeps in the car.
Okay. How are you getting on?
Well, I'm still here.
Well done.
But, I mean, in the last year that things happened to me, I've seen so much stuff, but I normally go to the food bank on a Thursday, and anyway, I gave this, because it went too far away, and the children didn't look particular like they had a lot of energy.
Yes, well, they wouldn't, would they? I mean, it's a circle of, I say deprivation, but because it sounds like such an ugly word, but that's what it is.
You're right there. But anyway, I mean, this lady invited me in, just for a cup of tea, but I don't know all the circumstances, but her husband died and she got evicted from her last place. But the actual kiddies, they're sleeping on a mattress which is on pallets on the floor. There's no carpet. She's got, well, there's nothing there. I mean, you know,
what's changed there? Because you would once have got a grant, wouldn't you? I'm going back 30 years when I had some knowledge of the system. You could get some sort of grant for an absolute essentials if you were moving into a new place. But then eligibility becomes an issue then, doesn't it? And not everyone's going to be eligible.
Well,
especially if it's not permanent accommodation, you're not going to be eligible.
I mean, there are some of these places, you know, furniture with people in need, and I said I know of one place, and I'm going to pop round there later just to see what things are. But you know, initially, you know, like I say, you know, and then, you know, you've got, you know, Richie that you were talking about. That, you know, the difference now, it has gone way too far.
Well, it's the conversation, isn't it? I try to explain, or at least to work out there why, you know, it's even listening to you, Gary, and not being able to do anything to help you, that there is a temptation to turn off. Do you know what I mean? It's that kind of, if I pretend you're not there, then I don't need to worry about the things that you're describing to me.
Well, you know, I mean, in some ways, I'm glad what's happened to me has happened, because 10 years ago, I would have done exactly what you've just said. But now that I've seen, a bit like taking the red tablet in the Matrix, I actually see what's going on. I just wish I could win the lottery to help the people that I know of that are more worse off than me.
And of course that reminds us that the point I was trying to make somewhat clumsily a moment ago about the number of people who use food banks also, or later when they're on better circumstances, become volunteers in food banks, certainly become donors, is I think you've just nailed the essence of that process in a way that I failed to do. Thank you, Gary. And I mean, that there it is, just the commonplace nature of a mattress on the floor or raised on pallets. That'd be to avoid getting damp. I mean, how can it be normal in modern Britain? I see Andrew Neil today tweeting about growth as if we should be celebrating, or you've got claims that we're the 5th largest economy in the country. You can see why people would rather not talk about the fact that there are 1 million children in the UK either sleeping on the floor or sharing a bed with parents or siblings. But I mean, you know, even if you want to avoid the detail that Gary's just shared with us, you could ask the question, why? And how have we ended up with a Prime Minister claiming that Keir Starmer is waging class war by talking about private schools? It's quite bizarre, isn't it? I'm increasingly persuaded we're not a normal country at the moment. Betty's in Newham. Betty, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, I think the conversation directly, I've always been wanting to talk about it more. I think this is the right platform to say something where someone can hear, or they can hear you clearly, because I've been in a one-bedroom with my 5 children. My son is almost 18, sitting his A-levels. He's going to sit his A-levels. My daughter, 16, 14, 5-year-old and 4-year-old. And, definitely it's all about bedding. You bed, but all the time we've slept in this one bedroom. It's full of damp, condensation, infested with bed bugs, everything. So I've been sharing the bed, but the impact is caused to the children, to where they are now, the teenagers. They can't even have friends around, family, because they will be bullied. They say they will be embarrassed. They go to school tired. They sleep in. They're always getting detention. And I keep talking to the teachers and everything. They kind of like, yeah, but nothing. It's like you failed as a parent. You do whatever you do, but the system fails you. I've written to everyone, the MP and everything, at least to get an extra room for my son, because privacy has also become an issue.
Of course it has.
And
how do you explain it to them, Betty? How do you explain it to them?
Do you know, I've really reached the point that I don't seem no one can understand, listen, or I don't know whether the policies are done around people whom they reach to, but people like us who can't be reached to, the real people who really experience these issues.
Well, you're out of sight, out of mind, really.
Exactly. And are we really in Britain? Because one time the children went to visit their grandparents and say, Mom, they're living better than us. That's way in Africa. Do you know? So they're losing hope. They're seeing they're in Britain, but the place they're in, it's like, yeah, we came here to look for green pasture for them to get better life, better.
Yes.
This is a few, yeah, but their childhood experience is really having no effect on them, mentally, physically, and they're thinking twice. So,
and they've got a loving mum. There'll be some children in similar situations who don't have the benefit of a loving mum on their side.
Exactly. So you try to hide everything, how they're living, how they're sleeping, so you don't feel they're disadvantaged. You don't feel they need to be bullied. They don't want to know. They don't want their friends around to know their situation. When their friends come to pick them up, they have to meet them miles away from home. All these things, hiding away, losing their confidence, their self-esteem, their up just because I can't afford a private accommodation, I can't afford the mortgage, No, this is where. But remember, these are the children. These are the future children of Britain, or
yes,
what? They're going to benefit. So where do mothers like us really? Sometimes someone told me it was your choice to have children. Okay.
Oh, I'll be getting texts in a minute asking why you've got so many children if the circumstances are so bad.
Exactly.
Yes.
So,
Here's one already. Here's one already.
So, I have children. That is out of control. I'll bear children. But does it mean to put me into such a situation because I've got the children that I can't be able to look after, or I need the system to look after for me? No. Yeah, I'm doing the best. They're not violent. They're not out there as trouble. They're not they're not these children that you find on the streets or doing anything. No, they're in education. Definitely, they will be benefited from them. One day they will put something into the country. They will be of benefit to the country more than even I. You know.
Well, that's generally the answer to the lazy questions about, you know, it's the same people as well, immigration and childbirth. People who don't recognise the need for the future population, and you're nailing that down, Betty. That sense of a social responsibility towards the next generation that extends beyond parenting and encompasses what we would think of traditionally as society. It's gone. It was never perfect, but the safety net, it seems to me, used to be a lot bigger and a lot more tightly knit than it is now. And as with Gary a moment ago, I wish there was more I could say to you, except just to offer you that opportunity to be heard and to be seen that you don't find anywhere else at the moment. And you're not going to find it in a government obsessing about parents being asked to pay a bit more in school fees for their already relatively very, very privileged children. It's, because no one's going to say to them, well, if you can't afford the school fees, why do you have the children in the first place? And yet there'll be the same people queuing up to say to Betty, if you can't afford beds, why do you have the children in the first place? 33 minutes after 11 is the time. Lottie Morley has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:37. I'm going to read you a text. It's about 12 or 13 lines long, but it's actually a Charles Dickens novel. Except this is 2023 in Brexit Britain. It's from Dee, who's in Preston. Hi, James, she writes. My son went to a friend's after school, and when he got home, he told me that his friend's sister, who was a baby, slept in a pram because they had no cot. We had a brand new cot that we were given in the garage, so I promptly marched round to his friend's parents with the cot, and all was well. Until we saw it advertised on a local selling page. Furious, I wanted answers. The mum, when I got there, broke down and said she can't feed a cot to her kids. There followed tears, guilt, and a trip to Aldi. That's the reality. How grateful I am I can afford the basics, where this mum gave up a bed for food. 11:38 is the time. Zara is in Portsmouth. Zara, what made you pick up the phone?
Morning, James.
Hello, Zara.
Hello. Well, basically, I've got two young children. Well, not quite young. I have a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old. They're both sharing a bed at the moment, but my 14-year-old girl, it's fully developed. She's seen her period, and most of the time, obviously, I do work.
Yeah.
So most of the time, my daughter would lash up at my son, get out of my room,
Well,
and
of
he would
course
go,
she's
well,
oh, man, that's just...
the room
Yeah.
doesn't belong to you because they have to share. I've been bidding. I'm in a similar position as the previous caller. I've been bidding for about 4 years. I've actually written a letter to my local, I don't even know what you call them again.
MP, councillor.
MP, yes, I wrote to her. You know what she responded to me?
No.
Unfortunately, social housing at the moment, it's very, very difficult to get housing. And obviously, we can't go private to rent. I am working.
No, I know, you keep saying that, and I know what...
I cannot afford to rent at the moment. I just can't afford it.
No.
And it's just... But one thing I'm going to say, James, is this year. When these kids are taken, God forbid, your child is taken away from you, what would they do? There are rooms available. There are people with rooms available to put these children in. So why can't you help us to bring our children in a safer environment? Give them all their own little space.
It's an interesting question. I mean, some of the accommodation in the care system is not very good. But you make a point about what would happen if they decided that because you can't, then they'd be fostered or they'd be put into a family home where they'd have a better circumstances at least than they have in their actual family home.
Yeah. So
it's crazy, isn't it? How do you explain it to you? Oh, I'm so sorry. I find I've got daughters of a similar age, and that absence of any privacy at all must be so...
It is, and it's appalling. So I don't understand what they expect us to do, because people have a go, oh, you don't work. But yes, you do work, but you can't afford to rent privately, and you can't afford to get social housing. Where do we go from here? What do we do? What's going on?
Have you thought about giving up Netflix and eating fewer avocados?
I don't have Netflix.
I know you don't have Netflix. I'm teasing you.
I don't have Netflix.
I know you
But
don't.
it's rather unfortunate I can't afford, because if I want to go privately, it's going to cost me so much money. Where am I going to get that money from?
It's the simple relationship. And I know why you keep mentioning that you're in work, but even if you weren't in work, if you were too poorly to work, or if you were between jobs, your plight would be just as unfair. It's the basic relationship between income and outgoings, isn't it? It just doesn't.
Yes,
it doesn't reach the sides.
Yes,
it doesn't reach the sides. Even as you play by the rules. Does your daughter understand? I mean, can you communicate to her that it's...
I mean, man, I'm actually she's sort of like, she lashes up a lot at everybody, you know, like me and the brother.
She's cross.
Oh, leave me alone.
Yeah.
I don't want to be here. If, you know, because the reason I brought the situation about moving them, like, obviously, if they take them away, is because she's mentioned to me, oh, well, when my friend got taken away from her mum, she's got her own bedroom.
Oh,
and that
Zara.
frightened me. That scared the living daylight out of me. For my child to say that, oh, when my friend was taken away from her mum, but she's got her own room.
She doesn't mean it,
So
Zara.
the previous lady said, my daughter can't even have her friends round, because obviously she's sharing with her brother. And majority of her friends, they have their own private space.
Of course. Where are they
So
going to
I'm
sit?
keeping her away to say, oh, you can't go for sleepovers, because then if I encourage the sleepovers, they would want to come and sleep over.
So it cuts both ways. You can't repay the hospitality, so she loses out twice.
Absolutely. It's a
I'm
nightmare.
sorry. It is a nightmare. And again, as I said to Betty, you know, you're there on their behalf, and there'll be some kids who haven't even got that, but it's not much reassurance to you, given the lack of the basic provision that you have. Thank you, Zara. 11:42 is the time. I can't leave the politics out of it. And it is, I say guilty as charged. You know, we lean into the conversations about private school fees a lot more enthusiastically than we lean into this. And yet Zara and Betty and others are out there every day listening to us talk about whether or not people really need to use food banks, or whether or not parents who are going to have to pay VAT on school fees are getting the support they deserve. And one of the richest men in the world accusing the son of a toolmaker of launching a class war from the top of a party that's presided over this for 13 years. 11:43 is the time. Robbie's in Sidcup. Robbie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Love the show.
Thank you.
Well, up until, say, 5 weeks ago, I shared a bed with two children. So I used to have a 10-year-old and a 3-year-old, and myself being a double bed. So I've only up until 5 weeks ago that we finally was able to move. I live in a social housing property, and have done all, a London and Quadrant property.
Yeah.
And I was born in one. Unfortunately, I'm 41 now. Unfortunately, I've never been able to. I've always sort of generally supported myself from a young age. Parents died fairly young.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I've never been. No, it's okay.
It's not.
It's back to life.
Yeah, it is, but I'm allowed to say I'm sorry. I wish they hadn't.
Yeah.
I'm allowed to say I wish they hadn't, Robbie.
Me too, James.
Yeah, exactly.
Me too. But neither here nor there, really. But more to the sense of I've never had the support there to say, there you go, there's a bit of money there to put towards a house or anything like that. Really, I'm a heating engineer, so I have a decent living. I'm a self-employed heating engineer, but my wife doesn't work. I support 5 of us on one wage. So to try and amass enough money to then buy a property, unfortunately, it's just not. It's never going to be possible. It's impossible. Not without living a normal life, And I'm not up for working.
No, for 20 hours a day or something stupid like that, or every week. You've got to spend time with the family if you can.
That's what we're here for, isn't it? That's what we're here for. So only just recently we've just been. We had to find a property ourselves because on speaking with our housing association over a long, long period of time, to and fro, we was just told we don't have the housing.
Yeah.
We don't have the properties. But where we live, I can count probably 10 properties that are boarded up, that are all owned by London and Quadrant. But the problem is, James, is that the funds that they have got now, they've amassed themselves so large that they can't afford, number one, to maintain the properties that they've got. Their maintenance is awful.
And bits that are council funded as well are being cut to the bone too. So a property stays empty because they can't afford to get it open. But actually, in the short term, they might be paying B&B rates for a family that could move into it. So it's costing them more than it would cost if we had sort of properly funded long-term local and national government. What changed? How did you? Because obviously you're the third parent in a similar situation to ring in, and you're the first one who's got over the line into the new property. What happened? How did that happen, Robbie?
Well, actually, it was a mutual exchange. So somebody out of the blue contacted us, who we had contacted a long time ago,
and they didn't need the space anymore.
And she wanted.
Right, our phone line's gone right at the end, but we got there. We got to the conclusion. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you for telling the story so sort of clear-eyed as well. The time is 11:46. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. More of your calls after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10 minutes to 12 is the time. I've teased you a little, haven't I, with things that have happened since I finished writing my new book that would have walked straight into the pages of my new book as even more evidence of its central thesis than I've managed to assemble in the 100,000 words that somehow I managed to squeeze out over the course of the first few months of this year. Someone I relied on quite heavily in doing some of the research is a journalist called Sam Bright, formerly investigations editor at Byline Times and now the UK deputy editor of The Smog, which is a climate investigations publication. He's also written a brilliant book called Bullingdon Club Britain, or Bullingdon Britain, isn't it? Is it Bullingdon Britain or Bullingdon Club Britain, Sam? We've got the phone. I think you're on mute. We've got sorts. Is it our end or his end? This is brilliant. It's his end, is it? Are you there now?
Yeah. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Is it Bullingdon Britain or Bullingdon Club Britain?
Bullingdon Club Britain.
Oh, my bad. Oh, sorry. So now the producer's cross with me because she thinks that I was ignoring her notes instead of... Oh, forget about it. Well, at least everyone can tell that we're live. So the reason I mentioned Sam's book, and indeed my book, is because this story that unfolded yesterday could not really tick more boxes about this ludicrous ecosystem of Tory party, so-called think tanks, really secretly funded lobby groups, and, of course, the right-wing media. I mean, even with your knowledge of this world, this story yesterday was a bit of a doozy, wasn't it?
Oh, it was a cracker. I think it just epitomises that ecosystem, as you've called it, James, that exists between these Tufton Street think tanks. Well, they call themselves think tanks, and essentially they're lobby groups for free market ideas, low taxes, less regulation, less environmental standards, and how they spoon feed that to the media, which is then distributed throughout Westminster and the public at large. Yeah, it was a staggering story.
Because what they happened to spoon feed yesterday, and I think we're talking about a think tank called Civitas, which, if memory serves, was originally part of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Is that the one? And then it kind of hived off because even they realise that they can't all turn up from the same organisation every day on every other radio and television programme in the country without someone smelling a bit of a rat. So they're constantly setting up and regenerating new outfits. They shared some quotes, research end quotes, into net zero that the Times, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, the Spectator and the Guido Fawkes hate site all regurgitated unquestioningly, but there were some fairly glaring errors in it, I gather.
Yeah, exactly. Spot on. So they claim that achieving net zero by 2050 will cost £4.5 trillion, so big, scary number, equivalent to £6,000 per household per year. So pretty hefty sum during a cost of living crisis, except that the report confused electricity output, in particular for onshore wind, mistaking megawatts, which is the overall output, and megawatts per hour, grossly exaggerating the potential cost of building new onshore wind, which, of course, the Conservatives have blocked in recent times, and putting that cost at £860 billion. Which is
you think at that point someone might. That's the point at which you tap your calculator, isn't it? And you think, really, because that can't be right, unless of course you're a kind of blinkered ideologue, in which case the bigger the number, the better the jackpot.
Well, this is the irony that Simon Evans, who's a brilliant environmental journalist at Carbon Brief, actually got a tip off that this report was coming and did them the service of contacting them a couple of days ago, the author, to point out the error, and it wasn't changed prior to publication. They went through with it anyway, and it seems that the journalists and the editors who splashed these headlines didn't look into it any further either. And something that Simon Evans points out as well is that not only is this basic miscalculation present in the document, but it also just glaringly overlooks several other factors in the great green transition. So the declining cost of renewables, the cost of subsidizing fossil fuels currently, the jobs that may be created in the electric vehicles market. It's sort of a whitewash for a pro-fossil fuel industry. Well, and of course, as you allude to, I think it was the Office of Budgetary Responsibility that calculated not doing anything was going to cost a hell of a lot more than doing anything. So the conversation is skewed from the beginning. In layman's terms, then, if they stuck a figure of $4.5 trillion on this, what would the real figure, if they'd actually done the sums right, have been? Do we know? We don't exactly know. They've acknowledged the errors in the report.
Have the papers acknowledged it? Go on.
Specifically in this section, they've acknowledged the errors. They haven't acknowledged that overall it misleads on the issue of net zero. I believe the Times has put an update on its piece. I'm not sure about the others.
Okay.
But I mean, as you acknowledged, the Climate Change Committee that advises the government and the Office for Budget Responsibility say that the cost of net zero will either be negligible or will actually benefit us because we'll have coped with the adjustments that have to take place as the climate changes.
It makes for breathtaking reading, even for veterans of this swamp like you and me, claiming that moving to developing electric vehicles could cost 114,000 jobs, and then quoting a study that said, in the same body of work, quoting a study that said the electric car market could support 246,000 jobs by 2040. It's head wobble time, isn't it?
It's maddening. And that's the thing, as we know, James, they've turned their cannons on net zero in this instance, but they've been doing this for years on a hard Brexit, on taxes, essentially creating the body of thought behind Trussonomics that crashed the economy last year.
It is exactly the same people. Let's not make any bones about it. Exactly the same people and exactly the same secretly funded ideologies, so-called ideologies.
Yeah, exactly. And, they move on to a new policy area, every 6 months or so, but they still seem to be underpinned by the same illiterate science and economics that caused our problems this time last year. And yet there's only a handful of people like you and me, sadly, and a few other
it will catch on.
Calling this out.
It will catch on. Onwards. Sam Bright doing great work over at the Smog, just as he did at Byline Times. And I really can't recommend Bullingdon Club Britain highly enough. Always a pleasure, mate. Thank you for steering us through these remarkably murky waters. It is, and you can read Sam's work at smog.co.uk. It's a wonderful resource, actually, I have to tell you. It's thesmog.com, I beg your pardon, DESMOG. It's a wonderful resource, not just for breaking journalism, breaking news, such as what Sam has just talked us through and shared with us, but also they've got like archives and resources that I really recommend you subscribe to. It is coming up to 11:59, which means we'll probably move on. I just want to read this from Rachel in Skye, because this is happening to me a lot, and I need to fix it. She says, in Scotland, families living in poverty get an extra £25 a week child benefit, hopefully rising to £30 next year. UNICEF has called it a game changer. It's taken thousands of kids out of poverty. Scotland has to manage on a budget. England is where the money grew. Why can't their government do it as well? Because every penny in Scotland is spent on the people, whereas every penny in England is spent on the politicians. I paraphrase slightly, you didn't quite say that. All but a penny is spent on the politicians. It's not quite like that, but it certainly is yet another example of prioritisation, political prioritisation being very, very different on either side, metaphorically speaking, of Hadrian's Wall. Wait for it. And speaking of Hadrian's Wall, you will no doubt have seen the story about the felled tree, the sycamore, that has, dominates newspapers today. The Daily Mail's got it on its front page. Look, they were never going to put the million kids without beds on their front page, but a chopped down tree makes it to the front page of the Daily Mail, and I find myself drawn to the humanity of the story, actually, not the dendrology. Look it up. Not the dendrology of the story, but the humanity. Well, why is this story so upsetting?
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 12 is the time. It's a mad one, isn't it? Because it's not politically salient. You speak to people like we spoke to in the last hour, Zara and Betty and Robbie, and you wonder, how can it not be politically salient? And the answer is that we have been groomed as a nation not to care about people whose children haven't got beds. We've been persuaded, but sometimes by people who do what I do for a living, not to care about them or not to believe them. Can't afford shampoo? Well, you shouldn't have had children in the first place. So that's why it's not politically salient, and it spreads from media to politician, which is why Suella Braverman exists, taking the worst excesses of the worst examples of the worst right-wing media rhetoric and trying to turn it into government policy. It's incredible, but it would be nice for the Labour Party to start pushing back. The problem they have is how do they campaign on something like that? I don't know. It's not going to help. Your children have got beds. Why would you vote for someone who's going to help others? Who's helping others? That's how you do it. We'll work it all out one day. It is 4 minutes after 12. I've got 2 or 3 things to do this hour, as well as the central conversation that we're going to have. I want to tell you my class war story, as promised in the first hour, that I've forgotten to share. We ran out of time. I didn't feel it would be appropriate in the last hour because it was pretty heavy going, pretty serious and important stuff. This hour less so. I'm going to put someone in Idiot's Corner, which we haven't done, I don't think, for a couple of days. I'll do that now. Should I do that now? I'll do that now. This is Tony from Chichester. In Tony's defence, although he is clearly an idiot, he was probably using, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, and think that he may have been using voice-activated technology to send this message. So some of the idiocy on display may have been accidental. Some of it, of course, was inherent. He goes, if you're present to James O'Brien, I think he meant presenter, and that's why I think it might be. If you're present to James O'Brien doesn't understand what is so much upsetting about that tree being cut down at Adrian's wall, Adrian's wall, he should not be talking or working with the public on your radio, says Tony in Chichester, who is of the view that if phone-in hosts ask questions, then they are not qualified to be phone-in hosts. You can perhaps see the problem with that perspective. Hopefully even Tony can now. But it's Idiot's Corner for you, my friend. 5 minutes after 12 is the time. And the other thing I have to do is set this story up in a way that accommodates both question and answer. Oh, and someone has sent me the poem. Thomas has sent me the poem that I quoted right at the very beginning. I was trying to at the beginning of the last hour, and I was trying to convey the importance of a bed. I know that sounds mad, but the importance of your own bed, an unshared bed. And there was a line from my childhood that has stayed with me forever. It was, oh, the snuggly bits where the pillow fits. And Thomas has found the poem for me. He sent me the poem. It's not very good, actually, but it's not bad. It's just a very childish poem, a poem for children. In fact, it's from a book called Poems for Children. It's called Ned by someone called Eleanor Farjon. And it actually makes even more sense now because it's about a kid who found it very hard to get out of bed but also hated bedtime, which was me. It was most children, I suspect. Could not get myself out of bed for love or money, but when it was bedtime, I'd be furious. Mum and Dad would be sending me to bed. So would you like to hear the whole thing or not? Well, I'm going to tell you the whole thing anyway because it was published in 1951 and it probably hasn't been shared on radio ever, let alone in the last 50 years. So it's called Ned, and this is the thing that I just have carried all my life as the distillation of the loveliness of bed, of an unshared bed. They tell him to shunt, and he gives a grunt and burrows a little deeper. So it's beginning with Mum and Dad trying to get him out of bed, right? Which is probably why one of my parents gave it to me to read at some point. They tell him to shunt, and he gives a grunt and burrows a little deeper. He's a trial to them at 8 a.m. when Ned is a non-stop sleeper. Oh, the snuggly bits where the pillow fits into his cheek and neck. Oh, the beautiful heat stored under the sheet, which the breakfast bell will wreck. Oh, the snoozely-oozly feel he feels from head to heel. When to get out of bed is worse to Ned than missing his morning meal. But it's a singular thing that Ned, after the sun is dead and the moon's come round, is not to be found and can't be got into bed. That's a lovely little poem, isn't it? Thank you, Thomas, for sharing that with us. I shall file that away and bore my own children rigid with it later. 8 minutes after 12 is the time. So here's the story. A tree at Northumberland's Sycamore Gap, which became Tree of the Year in 2016. The Woodland Trust runs that wonderful, wonderful competition. It's one of the most photographed, if not the most photographed tree in the UK. Was chopped down the other night. A 16-year-old has been, I think, arrested. He was in police custody this morning, but I think I heard on the bulletin that he no longer is. It was 36 metres tall, and what made it so spectacular and so photographable, if that's a word, was the way that it sat almost symmetrically in the centre of a gap in the wall. So you've got rising sides bordering both sides of the tree, going up to 36 metres tall. It's not in the wall, it's in a dip in the Northumberland National Park. It's an absolutely beautiful tree and a beautiful picture, and it would appear that someone has chopped it down. Do you know, my wife said to me when we were talking about this yesterday, she said it'll be some social media thing. It'll be some attempt to get clout on social media, and it may even involve, and a lad at work, EJ, who works on the online side of things, said it could be some sort of online dare, like some online challenge. There's a lot of that about, apparently. And I listen, charges may yet be brought, and you don't want to focus on that side of it. But some kid is going to be, can have this hanging around his neck for the rest of his life, the silly old sausage. But it's not that side of it that I want to talk about. I want to talk about your response to it. Because I felt this very keenly, and I'm not entirely sure why. I don't think I've ever seen it, except in the Robin Hood film, where in the classic traditions of Hollywood, Kevin Costner playing Robin Hood, making his way, I think, from Dover to London, somehow ended up standing next to a tree on Hadrian's Wall. You don't need to be a geographer, do you, to appreciate how ridiculous that is in simple terms? What's that you say, Robin? We're making our way from Dover to London. Oh, behold, a beautiful tree. And anyone who was familiar with the view would have known that tree sits, pretty much 9/10 of the way to Scotland. It sits in the middle of the Northumberland National Park. So that is some detour. That's some detour. It's a miracle he ever got his hands on the Sheriff of Nottingham, making his way from Dover to Nottingham, possibly, rather than London. You still go nowhere near Northumberland. You go nowhere near the Sycamore Gap, as it was called. But I've certainly seen pictures of it. I think, again, talking to my wife about it yesterday, she's seen it. She's seen it in the flesh. She thinks I have. I can't remember, but... And I mention that not just to highlight how Swiss cheese my memory is these days, but also to highlight that I don't have a personal investment in it. I can't remember wrapping my arms around it or feeling its sort of bark. I don't have a visceral personal memory inside. Why are you laughing? Just the way I said bark. Did I sound like Alan Partridge? I did, didn't I? Oh, no. So 12:11. I've got to keep this up till 1 o'clock. There's no personal connection with it. And yet when I read the story and when I saw the stump, when I saw the stump, I felt awful. I felt awful. Why? We're not going to get a better caller than Nick got this morning. Nick took a caller from a fellow whose granddad, I think, had run away to sea practically, been imprisoned in the war, and his sort of lodestone, if that's the right word, for memories of home was this tree. So that family will be dealing with some real heartbreak today. But for the rest of us, what is it? There's two questions here. It might actually be the same question. What is it about trees that speaks to us inside, that speaks to something primal? That's part of the answer. It speaks to something primal. Anyone who was listening to Mystery Hour last week when the botanist James Wong rang in will already have some beginnings of an answer to this. But what is interesting for us this hour is that some of it is conscious and some of it is unconscious. Why? What do trees do to you? 0345 6060 973. But even though we're going to have a fair crack at describing and sharing the emotional connection with a tree that speaks to many, many, many of us, if not all of us, having a visceral emotional reaction to a tree you've never visited being cut down is just weird, right? So what's that all about as well? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. I don't think, even though I'm in full Partridge mode today, I don't think we can't take calls on favourite trees, can we? It just doesn't. I'd love to, but I just don't think it's going to work on the radio because it's quite visual. It's quite a visual thing. I'm laughing at my own things I haven't said yet. I was about to say, unless you're really good at describing trees. Oh, sack it. It's Friday. You can only ring in to tell me about your favourite tree if you're really good at describing trees. I may have to insist that you can actually see it. You can't be describing it from memory. But that's very much the third leg of this conversation. The story that I want is the story about the connection that we feel. Why do we feel such a deep and rather special emotional connection with a tree? 0345 6060 973. Why would we, even given that emotional connection with trees, why would we feel so aggrieved by the chopping down of a tree we've never visited or seen in the flesh, in the wood? 0345 6060 973. And finally, this could end badly. Tell me about your favourite tree, but only if you're really good at describing trees. 0345 60 I've forgotten the flipping number now. This is all falling apart. Well, I haven't forgotten the number, but I just wanted to do a joke. So 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 18 minutes after 12 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where if you think I was exaggerating in the first hour of the programme about the desperation with which Tories are now trying to turn anything into a culture war, then I've got news for you. Rishi Sunak has just said that the Welsh Government's policy of reducing speed limits to 20 miles per hour in some areas does not reflect, and I quote, the right values of the British people. 30 miles per hour. Yeah, that's it. That's British. Yeah. Rule Britannia. Britannia rule the way. 20 miles an hour. Oh, my God, he might as well be Nazis. So a 20 mile per hour speed limit does not reflect the values, the right values of the British. What about in the areas where there is already a 20 mile per hour speed limit? Does that not reflect? And you've driven through them. They're all over the place. So are they not properly British roads? I don't know. But we're not talking about British roads. We're talking about British trees. What is it about trees that speaks to something within us to such a degree that you can feel so upset by the chopping down of a tree that you have never personally visited? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And it is a brutal act of vandalism. And I'm laughing more at my own failure to explain myself than I am. I'm certainly not laughing at the attack on the tree. I'm trying to describe my mystification at feeling so upset by it. Verity's in Bradford. Verity, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Long-time listener, first time. I've got 3, so I'm a little bit nervous.
Thank you, and welcome aboard. I bet you thought it wouldn't be about trees, didn't you?
No, I didn't think it would be. No. So I went to visit. I went up to Northumberland last week for a few days, and so only last Wednesday was I at Sycamore Gap for the first time. It's been a little place that I'd wanted to go to for a while. Yes. Obviously watched Robin Hood, the Robin Hood film, but it was amazing to see it in the flesh, and it was a beautiful late summer's day.
I don't know that there'd be a bad day to see it because it's framed itself. It's framed by nature in such a beautiful way, but obviously a sunset or a sunrise or a misty morning would add elements, but it's beautiful by definition.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons why we've got such an emotional connection with trees, and particularly this one. But it was just amazing to see it in the flesh, and I think for trees of that age that have been there for several hundred years, it's a sort of symbol of longevity and our relationship with nature, and I think something constant. And I'm also lucky for the view that I have from my flat. It overlooks part of the River Aire, and so the trees a symbol of sort of changing of the seasons to me, and I think particularly had a different appreciation for them since lockdown and spending a lot of time at home and seeing the weather change. And I think I think not just Sycamore Gap, but there were other parts of the UK.
I think you're right.
I think special to me that we have that relationship.
Well, they remind us how small. They remind us how small we are. Actually. Yeah. So when you mentioned that about, how old was this tree? Do we know?
I think it was about 300 years old. I think that's what I read in The Guardian yesterday, but I'm not sure.
No, but it would be. Right. So that reminds you that, sometimes I find it very helpful to be reminded of my own insignificance, because particularly if you're struggling with something and you sort of, in the great scheme of things, I'm not even going to be around as long as that tree. It doesn't. And the big skies, for me, I've said this before, during lockdown, I missed the sky so much, the big sky that you can get lost in. And it speaks to all of that, doesn't it, a tree like this?
Absolutely. And I grew up in Lincolnshire, so I'm used to kind of big
flatness
skies.
Yes. Long views.
I don't get back to very often anymore, but and I think our relationship with nature and well-being, and I'm working with a group of vulnerable people at the moment on a well-being in nature program.
Lovely. Gosh. Tell me a bit about that. How do you measure success in that? How do you know when it's working? What change does it affect in people?
I think it's participants response and their involvement and getting involved in the activity. And actually, I'd done one of those workshops yesterday morning, and then I was on my way home and heard about the tree. A friend of mine alerted me to the news about Sycamore Gap, and I just felt I'd had such a kind of positive feeling after spending the morning with these amazing women, and who've been through so much in their lives already, and then hearing about the tree, it just completely changed my mood.
Through you, of course it did. Of course, it did.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Verity. That's a lovely start and a lovely debut on the programme, if I may say so. And there's not, again, it's one of those phone-ins. It's not like someone's going to ring in and nail it. It's not mystery hour. You're not going to go definitive and get a round of applause. It's almost as if every person is going to have a different answer to the same question. I'm not taking calls or reading out texts from people who think it's all ridiculous. That's fine. I'm not putting you in idiot's corner either, but this is a conversation for people who don't think it's ridiculous to have responded in this way to this story. I acknowledge your existence, but I will not be inviting you to partake in this exchange. 23 minutes after 12 is the time. Millie is in Gloucestershire. Millie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Well, it's a strange thing, isn't it? I am frying onions, but when I was describing why I wanted to call to your producer, I got tears in my eyes.
Oh.
No, seriously, I don't want to end up the butt of some joke, but it's a really weird thing. We live in a house. I asked your producer to just say I lived in Gloucestershire,
right?
Because I don't want some social media scally turning up with a chainsaw to ruin my dreams.
That's a fair point.
But we've lived in this house since I was 27. I'm 60, so I'm a bit older than you.
Gosh.
And at the end of the field behind our house is a huge, huge, ancient, well-balanced, thriving oak tree. And from every window in our house, virtually every window, we look at this tree. I've sat upstairs in the bedrooms, pregnant, feeding my children, reading them bedtime stories, taking them for walks, walking my dog. You can hear I'm a bit emotional, can't you?
I can, yes. It's there. It's an anchor. You're describing an anchor, an enormous, beautiful anchor.
That's exactly it. And it is just a really beautiful tree. And it's full of wildlife. And we get deer that graze underneath it. And we have cranes, huge common cranes that graze underneath it. So it's an extraordinarily lovely spot. But it is just a very, very beautiful tree. And I said to your producer, in the same way as when the Queen died, who I've obviously had there in the background all my life, and I wouldn't describe myself as a rabid monarchist.
Sure.
But when she died, I was very powerfully affected by the sense of change. Oh, there we go again.
Permanence.
And the tree is the permanence, exactly. And it's just beautiful.
Gosh. Did you say cranes?
Cranes,
As in the big birds?
Yes, but don't talk about it. It might give it near away.
Not those sort of cranes.
No, just large crows.
And then I don't. At risk of prompting your tear ducts still further.
Sorry to be sympathetic.
No, don't do that. Everyone's in exactly. I've already banned people who aren't reacting emotionally to this story from contributing to the conversation. So you've got nothing to worry about. I mean, bringing the Queen into it is a bit of a masterstroke because it speaks to that sense of just being almost shaken by the reminder that things are not permanent and that they can be taken away, something that we just presumed would always be there.
They can. And just to tweak it a bit more.
Yes.
My kids recently had to have a tree taken out of their garden. Somebody had planted it years ago and it had been given to them as a gift, not my children, but the people who'd previously owned the house, as an anniversary present or a wedding present or something. And it was a magnificent tree, but it was destroying everything in its vicinity, and it had to go. And honestly, we all felt like murderers. It was like ecocide that we were committing. It was terrible, and we've all resolved to make sure we plant lots of acorns all over the place and other trees where they can. Yes, and just to tweak everyone else's tearbucks a bit, my very best friend from school died last year, and one of the comforting things for her was to be. Sorry, here I go. In a woodland burial ground.
So you can visit her.
And she chose a hawthorn because it does berries for the birds. So I think trees and humans have a long history.
I think you've made that absolutely crystal clear, Millie. Thank you.
Sorry, stop
apologising. Really, it's nice. It's sharing. It's humanity, and what you've done is nail down both the mystery and the beauty of it. Why on earth would we get emotional about trees? Answer: because of where they take us. what they make us think of, what they subconsciously and consciously provoke within us. It's all there. Memories of your friend right through to the sense of security that's been there throughout your adult life. 27 after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So the chopping down of it in this violent, unexpected way, it just sort of shakes us. It shakes our equilibrium, even if you've never visited the tree. The older it is, the more you know about it, the more shaken you will feel. Sam's in Stewarton in Scotland. Sam, what would you like to say?
Hey, good afternoon, James. My wife will kill me if I don't say this, but long-time listener, first-time caller.
It's not a rule, but thank you.
She'll love it. Yeah, it's a weird one. Like, I've always been a massive sort of like Robin Hood fan, and the first time I ever saw the tree was watching the Prince of Thieves film. And it's just sort of like, it seems to be a bit of like my childhood, really. Yes. So, Sundays I'd be sat there watching Robin Hood, and, there they'd be. And then the first time I sort of like had a holiday away from the parents, we did like a camping trip, walking around the Hadrian's Wall.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, sort of like 16, 17 years old. And sort of every time you see the picture of the tree, you get like flashbacks to, the childhood, really. And
yeah.
It's just a bit sort of like,
No, I do. So I mean, that's the celluloid representation of it is really key. Actually, there's one bloke there who's quoted in the Times today. He'd come from New Mexico to show his wife the tree. I mean, they were on a walking holiday. It wasn't a flying visit. They didn't just fly in, see the tree, and fly out again. But that's how iconic it is. So I mean, they thought it had fallen down originally. Why? And this isn't what you rang in to answer, and you may not be able to. I'm not sure I can. If it had fallen down in a storm, we wouldn't be feeling what we're feeling now.
No, I think that would just be a kind of natural sort of, happening, so you kind of, I think there'd be a lot of people who'd still be a bit upset about it, but it'd be a kind of, well, it can't be helped,
Nature read into whatever the arboreal equivalent of nature being read in tooth and claw might be, but an act of humanity, or rather a human act, just flipping jars, doesn't it?
It's a bit sad because in November we've booked ourselves a little holiday home not far away from the wall, and my wife, she's never been up there. Like I love Hadrian's Wall and that area, so I've always sort of like said to her, we'll go there with the dogs and go to the Sycamore Gap and have a little picnic, but sort of. Well, the gap. We can't do that now.
No, well, you can. It's just. I mean, I'm not being glib, but the tree won't be there. That's all. But no, you're touching again. You're as with all the calls on this, it's there, isn't it? You can feel it, and you can articulate some of it, but you can never articulate all of it. The final paragraph of the Times story is of a piece with the whole thing, really, because there is a sense of the absurd, but it's attached to the tragic and the beautiful. And this paragraph, I had to read it twice before I understood exactly what it meant. It says, in 2003, the Sycamore Gap avoided being felled after a helicopter hired by a TV crew crashed 30 metres away, narrowly avoiding the tree and the presenter Alan Titchmarsh. So there it is. 12:31 is the time. Headlines now with Amelia Cox.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are somewhat unexpectedly discussing the national sadness about a tree being chopped down in Northumberland yesterday. The story's got the lot in many ways, except the surprise of the central character. A photographer who lives about 45 minutes away turned up immediately because he thought it must be a hoax. But the rumours began to spread that it had been deliberately felled, and people found it impossible to believe. You can understand why. First reports were that it had been blown down in a storm that night, but no, it was chopped down, clearly chopped down. And a 16-year-old local boy, has reportedly been, he has been arrested. So why? What is it? So of course, I forgot that some of you wouldn't have heard Mystery Hour. James Wong, who you will know as probably the most famous botanist in the country, isn't he, really? But he's a brilliant communicator, truly brilliant communicator. Did a wonderful Full Disclosure episode with us last year. And he explained It was one of those magical moments on Mystery Hour, actually. One of my all-time favourites. I said so at the time. I gave him a Ray Liotta. Someone rang in with a question about views. It was such a strange question, and yet such a beautifully simple question that, as often happens on Mystery Hour, as you probably know, you wonder how it's never been asked before. So what is the evolutionary explanation for liking certain views? Think about it. Why do I like that view? I'm looking at this tree here. Why is that more pleasant to me than looking at that mug over there? Why? Inanimate objects, effectively. I know a tree's alive, but, looking at its berries, why do we like that view? And James talked about I forget the words he used. It protection and produce. Protection and produce. So that tree there speaks to you as a primal being who would use it for shelter. You don't realise that that's happening, but the fundamental connection to trees in general, or to a tree in particular, is like your inner lizard knowing it could live in that tree or under that tree. It speaks to your primal self, the sense of shelter. Now, a big view, so you've heard me bang on about big skies a lot. I love the expanses of beach, particularly in North Norfolk, that I know well. Why is that so? Well, the reason why you like big views like that is because they speak of security also. You know you're not going to be attacked because you can see that there's no one coming. There's no, saber-toothed tiger coming over the horizon because you can see the horizon. And that speaks to security as well. So you've got the tree, you've got the gap, you've got the view. And then the reason also why we might like beautiful images of nature, either in our eyes or on screens or on pieces of paper in front of us, is because they're a source of food. Now, you might not be able to eat a sycamore tree, but if a sycamore tree is growing somewhere, then the chances are that you've got more chance of growing something there that you can eat than you have in areas where nothing's currently growing. So even, what's the word I want? Fecundity, if you like. Arboreal fecundity or agricultural fecundity speaks to something primal in us as well. So there are reasons for this that are, well, biological or certainly evolutionary, and yet that doesn't go all the way, does it? Why would you be so sad, so traumatized even by the knowledge and then the sight of this tree being chopped down with a chainsaw, which again is grim. The general manager of the National Trust up there said he believed it was carried out late at night. I think it would have probably been done in about half an hour. You can see they've marked where they wanted it cut, so this wasn't a spontaneous thing. It would have been done in the night when nobody could hear the sound of the chainsaw because of the wind, but we have to let the police carry out their work. And the police said we've made one arrest, but it's at a very early stage. We're keeping an open mind. 12:39 is the time. Speaking of full disclosure, I must play you a little clip from this week's episode with the rather splendid author and activist Naomi Klein. It's a bit of I say it every week, but because it's true every week. It's a cracker, an absolute crackerjack of an episode. I've recorded 3 this week. I know what you're thinking, James. You work so hard on our behalf. I hope you're having a nice, relaxful, restful weekend. I've recorded 3 podcasts this week. And we address, actually, a little bit of the imbalance between the number of male guests we've had and the number of female guests. So you'll get Naomi Klein this week, and then in the coming weeks, you get Susie Dent and Mary Beard, who actually had quite a lot in common, those two, in terms of their enthusiasm for their very different subjects. In Susie's case, of course, words in general, and in Mary Beard's case, history in general, and the Romans in particular. But the 3, for the privilege, the unbelievable privilege of spending 3 hours in the company of 3 incredible women, all of whom you'll be able to enjoy via the Full Disclosure podcast. But James Wong's is on there as well. There's a whole archive of it. Let's get back to the phones and stop blathering. Paul's in Ware. Paul, what would you like to say?
James, hello. Good afternoon.
Hello, mate.
We've walked for charity, Hadrian's Wall, 4 times. And each time we walk it, we put a little message on a stone by the tree, what the charity's for, who it's for, yes, etc. Now, not only that, it's a place where people have put their ashes of their loved ones. It's a place where people have proposed, etc. It's just I'm so gutted.
Oh, mate.
Yeah. Not only that,
why? Not why are you gutted, but why this tree? Why does this tree speak to you more than other trees?
It's such a memory for so many people, and it's a focal point because you've got Twice Brewed, the pub and hotel, which is probably 2 miles to the south of the tree, which is like we're at the tree, so we're going to go get a drink. That's our sort of psyche on that one. But it's just such a shame, and I can honestly see this being like a little sick trend now. I can see. I can.
Yeah, because anything for attention.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just all those little stones that are there, which are going to be abandoned now, and obviously the
I don't
little
think
bag
so. I think something will. I use the word metaphorically, not biologically, but I think something will grow up in its place. I don't know what.
Well, I was saying to my wife yesterday, something like a figure, same as the Angel of the North type thing, but in a tree.
Yeah.
A beautiful bronze.
That's a great idea. That's a lovely idea, actually. I'd be surprised if they don't do something. National Trust is a wonderful organisation, also under attack from Tufton Street, would you believe? I didn't think there'd be a crossover with this and the conversation we had at the end of the last hour. But no, you're right. What charity? Can you tell us a bit about the charity?
Well, I can. One of them's for a dear little niece of mine who had stage 4 neuroblastoma. The other one's for my wife's dad. And then the other 2 were for major charities like Alzheimer's and
so would you do it every couple of years then, or
we do it every year? I've done it every year for the last 4 years. Yeah,
good man.
We try and do it in 3 days, which is a hell of a way. But
when are you off? When are you off on the next one? Do you know?
The next one will be next March. Yeah,
good luck.
We do it before the summer. Yeah, thank you very much, James.
That's a lovely thing to do, and you remind us that it's going to have a very, very personal resonance, not just a kind of primal one probably for millions of people. A quick text this. I never knew I had an inner lizard, which means you've never read Lee Child. You've never read the Jack Reacher books. So he talks a lot about our lizard brain, the things that are almost inexplicable, but are completely primordial. So, the lizard brain is what... Yeah, it is. It's true, this stuff. It's in Jack Reacher. It must be scientifically sound. It's in Lee Child's books. The lizard brain is like your fight or flight. Fight or flight is lizard brain stuff. There you go. Guys in Charing. Charing or Charing?
Charing, James. Charing in Kent.
Carry on, Gary. Guy.
Guy.
Charing.
That's
I got all my words mixed up there. So I've got Guy, Charing and Carrie. And I think I got them all mixed up. So I've turned into Eric Morecambe playing the piano. What would you like to say, Guy?
Well, first up, thank you for being a tree-waving knowledge in a river polluted by the Tories. You've provided us with a bit of sanity, but everybody's kind of touched on where I think this deep-seated affection with trees lies, and that is the fact that if you trace our species, if you like, all the way back to the beginning, we were living in and around, for instance, yew trees before the Christians turned up and built the big stone churches and went, come inside, it's warmer. They provide us with food, shelter, sustenance. They have a skin much like ourselves. They have a vascular system much like ourselves.
I don't know if there's a word for it. So when we imbue animals with human characteristics, like Peter Rabbit, or you know what I mean. I think it's called anthropomorphism. So this would be, and I think is it all Greek? So it would still work. It would be dendromorphism. No,
I'll have to take your word for it.
Or maybe you could have anthropomorphism with trees as well. So we're giving them, and I don't know if you've read Tolkien, but the trees play quite a big role in Tolkien, don't they? I think they're called the Ents, E-N-T-S, and they never ever come to life unless there's a massive war and a great threat to, I don't know, the hobbits or something. And the trees then come to life and they march. So we do have that sense of them being more alive than other plants, I think.
Yeah, they were also a place to gather, to share knowledge. So the stories were almost described as in being in amongst the trees. The stories of our ancestors were carved into the barks of trees, not necessarily, but
no, metaphorically, figuratively speaking. And of course, to add to that, I think a lot of prehistoric religions or very, very old, like Druids and before, they would focus on specific natural phenomena like a stream, a spring, or a tree.
Yeah, and
Really?
they also associate
Mistletoe.
very well with childhood memories or memories of family. You had the gentleman talking about planting a tree, or the lady, sorry, talking about planting a tree. My grandmother passed away in Australia, but she grew up in Amesbury, so we planted an English oak tree on the boundary of the Amesbury Cricket Club.
Oh, how glorious. Yeah, and it is there. It's sort of defying human mortality.
Yes, one would hope so.
One would hope so. Thank you. And Hard says, don't forget the magic faraway tree, James. Well, that speaks to something within us as well for fans of Enid Blyton, although perhaps not quite as directly as the tree that commemorates a loved one. I think, and Tess takes even that a little further, I think ancient trees remind us of our ancestors, standing there experiencing that same view. They are nature's parents, grandparents and great-grandparents. That's very poetic as well, Tess. I'm a sucker. I must have told you this before. I love, as I get older, I collect views that won't have changed in 100 years. So apart from electricity pylons and phone boxes and things like that, but usually, shop fronts have changed, things have been... I love walking through built-up areas. I'm talking about towns and cities. And you get down to Fleet Street or up near the city where I am in London, and you sort of think, that view there, but a lot of the times by the Thames, you think that view there probably hasn't changed in 100 years. The thing about the countryside, of course, is that that's true almost everywhere you go. Apart from growth, apart from the cycle of nature, you're looking at permanence. You're looking at something that does sort of speak to existence beyond the span of human life. 12:48 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:52 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I will play you a little clip of my full disclosure interview with Naomi Klein, the American author and political activist. It's quite hard to set up the premise of her new book, Doppelganger. But I said, what, Canadian? Yes. She's American, actually. She moved to Canada. She was born in Canada as a consequence of her father dodging the draft or fleeing the draft in the Vietnam War. So she sees herself very much as being both Canadian and American, something that we cover in the interview, which is definitely worth listening to. But the reason why the book is called Doppelganger is because there is another writer, a North American writer called Naomi Wolf, who published a book called The Beauty Myth in a similar ballpark to when Naomi Klein's first book came out, called No Logo, which was a sort of seminal critique of capitalism and a crucial platform of the Occupy Wall Street movement. You remember that? And because they've both got the same first name and they both operated, past tense, in a similar intellectual space, they're both Jewish and both very bright, lots of people started getting them mixed up. Now, you can live with that, people getting you mixed up with someone else, when you have quite a lot in common. But the other Naomi Wolf, has gone full kind of GBBs, is the best way of putting it. She's gone full conspiracy theory. She got very, very embarrassingly outed live on the radio for having made an epic error in a book. And it meant that a lot of people started attacking Naomi Klein for the transgressions of Naomi Wolf, which is why Naomi Klein decided to write about it. But of course, not just about that experience of mistaken identity, but about the whole nature of rabbit holes and conspiracy theories and the sort of completely bonkers beliefs that until relatively recently would get you a job on GBBs, although that oil tanker seems to be in the process of turning around now. In fact, I think Naomi Wolf has popped up on there a couple of times. So that's one of the backgrounds of the book, but really it's about the changing nature of conspiracy theories, and it was her that first warned me about AI and the threats that could pose in the near future. Anyway, have a listen. It's quite a long clip, this, but I want you to get a proper flavour of why it was such an engaging conversation.
I mean, I think there's something really freeing about looking at your own public self with anthropological curiosity, as opposed to sort of protective grabby energy, like I need to assert myself. It's like, oh, this is interesting. I'm curious about what is happening with the fact that so many people are confusing me with someone else. And that, I can tell you, that's made me quite relaxed.
Good. Yeah, but that comes across, well, you tell us, don't you? But the sort of universal nature of it is the bit about all the people you've encountered who can't speak to their family members anymore. The journey that these people go on which you examine through one experience, but really it's countless experiences, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that the isolation of the pandemic really exacerbated it because, you know, the self is, we understand who we are through a combination of some internal sense of self and who the world reflects us back to us as being, right? Or who our friends tell us we are, who our family members tell us we are. If you're a public person, then maybe you have listeners who tell you who you are. During the pandemic, we lost that external piece. So we went online to try to find some simulation of that community, that network of friendship, but it's not the same. And so I think people started falling down the rabbit hole much more quickly because they didn't have the usual networks pulling them back, going, that's actually not you. No, come back, Grandma.
Also, they were working very hard to convince themselves that it was the same. So I found it hard to do phone-ins on this because I didn't want to open up the phone line to the people who were lost, as it were. But when we hit upon the tactic of talking to the people left behind, then it became absolutely fascinating and heartbreaking at the same time.
Absolutely,
and
I'm finding that.
Speaking to partners, not just cousins and friends, but partners.
I mean,
sharing a house with someone who thought that their new Facebook friends were their real friends, and their old family and friends were being increasingly excised from their life.
Well, there are women who wouldn't sleep with their partners because they didn't want their vaccines to shed onto them. Which is an absolutely fantastical story that my doppelganger played a not insignificant role in spreading.
And the separation of sewage, that was her as well, wasn't it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So was there a point then that where it, get this right, so it's so bonkers that it doesn't bear looking at or thinking about, and then suddenly it's still bonkers, but it does bear.
Yeah.
It is a correct subject of inquiry.
Well, I mean, it sometimes seems half the population, certainly when I'm in the U.S., that has just taken a flight into a world where they can just manufacture facts at will. And I don't want to pretend that everybody who's not them is very seriously looking at the facts all the time.
Well,
I mean, I think we all have ways of distracting ourselves and disappearing into our own vanities and egos, and it's very hard to be alive to the weight of our moment of intersecting crises. But that is different than just deciding you're just going to make up a whole bunch of extremely alarming facts like these vaccines have caused a genocide and the government is hiding it from you. So that affects everything. Like if you have a large portion of the population that is just deciding to sever from any shared reality, how are we supposed to confront any of the crises that we face? So that's when I decided that this was a worthy subject. As somebody who's, I work at a university, I teach, courses about the climate crisis. I help lead a research center about climate justice. I still care about all of that, but I really am concerned that we're not going to be able to make any progress at all if we're not looking at this piece of it, which is huge, which is just the world of conspiracy culture and make your own reality.
That would touches on a lot of the conversation we've had together, but she's so bright. It's quite intimidating, to be honest with you. It is a bit like being in a room with Sheila Fogarty. I am going to leave you with a poem. This isn't going to become a regular feature, but given that we stumbled across that poem from my childhood earlier, and we've spent an hour talking about the Sycamore Gap, the tree in Northumberland, this is one of my favourite poems by Philip Larkin called The Trees. The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. The recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief. Is it that they are born again and we grow old? No, they die too. Their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. Yet still the unresting castles thresh in full-grown thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. And that's it from me for another week. We'll do it all again on Monday morning from 10. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, rewind live radio, or enjoy the whole show podcast. All LBC's shows are there, as well as the world's biggest podcasts, including, of course, Full Disclosure. Rewind live radio on Global Player. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4 on LBC, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.